It was a perfect day. The weather was perfect, and the forest was perfect too. In the afternoon, the sun was shining through the trees, making shadows on the ground. There was a little wind, and the air smelled like pine needles and dirt. As the wind blew through the trees, I felt like exploring the forest. The forest is my safe place, a place where I can think and relax. It was a calm day. The sun was shining through the trees, creating shadows on the ground. There was a little wind, and the air smelled like pine needles and soil. As the wind blew through the branches, I felt like I needed to explore the forest. The woods have always been my place to relax and think. I don't worry about the problems of life when I'm in the woods. I don't think about my family or my marriage. I know every path and tree in the forest, and I know all the secret places where I can think. But this afternoon, I felt like the forest was calling me for a special reason. As I walked through the woods, I felt like the forest wanted me to do something important. I was looking forward to some peace and quiet, so I could get away from the stress of life and my marriage. I was familiar with every trail and tree, as well as each hidden cove where I could think. This afternoon, however, I felt like the forest was calling me. As I walked along the well-worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the house, footsteps, and distant voices getting quieter. I heard a bird singing quietly in the trees above me, and it sounded almost too quiet. I really enjoyed the silence. This was my special place, a place where I could finally relax. Today, I went further into the forest than usual. The tall trees made a roof above me, and I was able to stay cool in the sun. I walked down a worn path, hearing the usual sounds of the house, footsteps, and distant voices getting fainter. I felt the leaves rustling under my feet and the birds chirping in the air, but it all sounded very calm. I really liked the silence. This was my special place, where I could finally relax. Today, I went deeper into the forest than usual. The big trees made a roof above me. I was guided by my feelings instead of a plan, and it felt nice. It was a day that seemed never-ending, and time was passing slowly. After what felt like hours of walking, I found a small clearing with a fallen log to rest on. It was the perfect place, hidden, calm, and with only the sounds of nature. I sat down, feeling the peace of the woods around me, and for a little bit, I closed my eyes, enjoying the quiet. It was just me and the peace, a whole world away. When I first noticed it, it was subtle. I might have thought it was the sound of movement, like a deer or a small animal in the bushes. As time passed, the sound got stronger. I was not scared of the woods, but I felt a shiver down my spine. I opened my eyes and saw Daniel, my stepson, standing a little distance away, half hidden by the woods. I was surprised to see Daniel, but he was even more surprised to see Mayhay had never been this deep in the woods before. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't think of what to say. We looked at each other for a long time. The quiet around us felt strange and electric. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I was surprised that Daniel was here. I didn't think anyone would come with me here. I said this to him, and he looked a little confused. I adjusted slightly with one hand against the rough bark of a nearby tree. There was an unusual intensity in his gaze that I couldn't quite place. I didn't want to interrupt you. He spoke in a tone that was less than usual, a bit hesitant. I was taking a walk and happened to see you. I thought about checking in to see if he needed any company. His explanation seemed simple enough, but his stare unsettled me. Daniel had always been straightforward, but this was different. I adjusted the log slightly with one hand against the rough bark of a nearby tree. There was an unusual intensity in his gaze that I couldn't quite identify. I didn't mean to interrupt. You were speaking more gently than usual, and you seemed a bit hesitant. I was taking a walk and happened to see you. I thought about checking in to see if you needed any company. He seemed polite, kind, and respectful, but we'd only ever been cordial friends. I entered his life when he was already an adult, a young man trying to figure out his own path. We used to have a good relationship, but our encounters had a formal quality, with a clear distance between us. I had always associated that distance with the nature of our relationship. Today, though, felt different, as if that distance had suddenly disappeared, leaving only the two of us in this lonely place. I invited you to stay, and I said. We were polite, kind, and respectful, but we only talked a little bit. I met him when he was already an adult, a young man trying to figure out his own life. We got along well before, but our meetings felt formal and a bit distant today, though, felt different. It felt like that distance just disappeared, and we were the only two people in this lonely place. I invited him to stay, and I said, until I put the fallen log beside me. I thought about how the forest is often better when there are other people there. He smiled, thinking hard, and then he sat down next to me. The distance between us felt small, much smaller than it should have been. But I tried not to think too much about it, so I wouldn't ruin the peaceful moment. "Do you come here a lot?" he asked, spinning around like he was trying to take in the whole forest at once. I said yes, and I took a deep breath. To calm down, I use this place as my safe space when things get too loud or hard. I go there to feel peaceful. For a long time, it has been a place where I can think and relax. He agreed with what I said without saying anything. I looked at his face and noticed how his face had changed. I remembered how he looked when we first met, a young guy in his late 20s, but now he looked like a guy in his late 30s. She looked serious and focused, and it made me feel like I didn't want to say anything. Under his careful watch, "It is beautiful here." He quietly said something, but I could barely hear. "I understand why you came here to get away from us." Our eyes met, and I felt a strange warmth spread through me. It was like a mix of curiosity and unease. I looked away, at a small sunbeam. He was thinking about something, but I couldn't tell what. Then he said, "I have always admired your ability to manage everything." His tone was. He was quiet, but I could tell he was thinking about something. I don't know why, but I felt a strange warmth and a special feeling, and I felt curious and nervous. I looked away, and I saw Daniel, my stepson. It was weird to feel these things outside of my family. I felt sorry for him, but I also felt like today was different. We didn't say anything for a while, and I listened to the sounds of the forest. I looked up at Daniel, my stepson, who was walking through the trees. It was strange to feel emotions that weren't related to my family. I felt sorry for him, but I also thought that today was different. We stayed quiet for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds sang from above, and a light wind stirred the leaves, creating a soft natural music. It felt strange, like we were in a world that was not part of our daily lives. Then, he broke the silence and said, "I have always admired your ability to manage everything." His tone was he was serious, like Dad's work often kept him away, "and you handle all the housework very well." I'm not sure if I've ever said this, but I've noticed it. I looked at him, amazed by the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Daniel, that means a lot to me." I almost said, my voice at a higher pitch than usual. I looked at him, astonished by the unexpected praise. "Thank you, Daniel. That means a lot to me," I whispered. I was deeply affected. I was genuinely moved by his words. It was uncommon for him to acknowledge me, and I had not realized how much I wanted that until he smiled. But this time, his expression was a little softer. I felt the atmosphere around us become heavy and filled with an intense attention. I felt like I didn't know what was going on, but I also felt like I couldn't ignore it. I thought about whether he felt the same way, but he didn't say anything. He asked me if I ever felt like I was just pretending to be someone else. He was looking at me, and he said that sometimes we act like a character, but deep down we're still ourselves. I realized that I didn't know much about him, but I felt like I understood him a little. He said things that I had thought but never said out loud. I agreed with him. It's easy to feel confused by what other people expect from you. He agreed, looking down, and with a he looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking deeply. He said, "I understand what you mean. I've been feeling the same way lately. I'm not sure who I am deep down. I wanted to make you feel better, but I'm not sure how to do that. So, I'll just speak my mind." He looked at me and said, "I have been experiencing that a lot recently, even though I am leading a life directed by someone else. Sometimes, I am not sure who I really am. I wanted to make you feel better, but I didn't know how to do it, so I let my words be my gift to you, Daniel. Finding yourself is a long journey. You are still very young, and you have the chance to decide who you want to be." He looked at me, and suddenly, his eyes showed a depth I had never seen before. He said he was grateful, but in a way that I couldn't hear. "I am glad you understand what I am going through." I think I have not talked to anyone else about this for a long time. We sat in silence, looking at each other as if we were meeting for the first time. The silence was obvious, but there was a shared understanding that went beyond words, and in a gesture that was innocent and personal, he put his hand on mine. I became frozen, my breath stopped, as I looked at our hands. His fingers were gently placed on mine, and the touch was simple, but it felt very powerful. I looked at him, but he kept looking at our hands. His face had no expression. I knew I should take my hand back and move away, but I didn't. Maybe it was because he looked like he needed help, and his eyes said that he wanted me to understand. I felt. He couldn't ruin the moment, and he had an emotion he couldn't describe. Then he looked at me, and I saw that he was nervous. He said, "You have always supported me." I felt happy, even though I didn't deserve it. He said, "Daniel, I have always worried about you." I said this quietly because there was no one around, and it felt like we were the only two people in the whole forest. We stopped in time and got caught up in a moment that neither of us understood then. As quickly as it started, he let go of my hand, breaking the magic. The cold air hit me, making the space between us feel more clear. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and confusion about what had just happened. We had just shared an experience, and I said that I should probably return. My voice sounded weak, and he nodded. His face showed that he agreed. We stood up and brushed leaves off our clothes. We started to walk back in silence. We were still connected, but neither of us wanted to talk about it. I just shared that I should probably go back. I said that my voice was shaking, and he nodded. His face looked like he was thinking hard. I agreed that we should go back, and we started to walk away from the forest. We were still connected, and we both knew that, even though neither of us said anything. As we walked back to the edge of the forest, I felt sad and like something was missing. Whatever happened between us in the woods would stay secret and not be talked about, but as we walked back to where we knew, I felt a strong sadness. I knew that memory of that afternoon would stay with me. It was a moment in time that had changed something deep within me. Something I could not forget. When I got home, I tried to get rid of the strange feeling that had stayed with me. I thought about that afternoon in the woods. The house was quiet. I could only hear the refrigerator and the creaks of the floorboards. I was doing my normal things, like cleaning the kitchen, sorting the mail, and making dinner for Robert and Daniel. It felt like the world was different. It was as if that short meeting in the forest had changed everything. While I was cooking, I kept thinking about Daniel. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on mine, and the depth of his gaze was unusual. I told myself it was nothing and that I was just thinking about it too much. I thought about my stepson and family, though. But even though I tried to think about something else, I still remembered I was thinking about Daniel. I was cooking, but I kept thinking about him. Then I heard Daniel's footsteps. He was standing next to the kitchen door. He was looking at me. I thought about my stepson and family. I tried to stop thinking about it, but I couldn't. Then Daniel came into the kitchen. I heard his footsteps. He looked at me. I looked at him. He had a strange look on his face, but he grinned a little. Then he looked at the stove and said, "Can I help?" I nodded and said, "Sure. I can dice those vegetables." I gave him a cutting board and a knife. He took the knife and cutlery. He touched my arm as he accepted them. He looked at me with a puzzled expression, and I grinned a little. He asked me to cut the vegetables, and I agreed. I gave him a cutting board and a knife. He took them, and he touched my arm when he accepted them. It was a simple action, but it felt special. I was aware of how close he was. I could smell his cologne, and the smell of herbs and spices, and it made my heart beat faster. I told myself to focus on stirring the pot, but I also tried to ignore the strange feeling in my stomach. I was aware of him, but I didn't want to let on. I was concentrating on stirring the pot. We worked in silence, and I could only hear the sound of his knife on the cutting board. I didn't want to look up, because I was afraid that he would see that I was nervous. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet. I kept my eyes on the stove, but I was nervous. I didn't want to look at him because I was worried that he would see that I was nervous. Then he spoke about what had happened in the woods. I felt like my face was burning, so I started wiping the counter to get his attention. I sounded a little angry, and he seemed nervous. I said, "I'm fine," but he seemed confused. After we met in the woods, I felt like I was reading his face and decided to clean the counter so he wouldn't keep staring at me. I sounded a little upset, and he seemed nervous. I said, "I'm not trying to be rude, but I'm not sure if we have a chance to talk." He replied, "I think we do. I'm glad you're interested in talking." I felt happy, and I said, "I'm glad we can talk. Let's talk about things." We looked at each other, and I could see that we understood each other, but then he stopped talking. I was hopeful that we could finally talk. I answered quickly, trying to act like I wasn't interested. I really liked the idea of talking about things. Our eyes met for a second, and we seemed to understand each other, but he quickly looked away and focused on his work. That night, we had dinner like we always did. Robert asked about my day, and I told him about my usual errands, but I didn't mention Daniel's unexpected visit. I felt like Daniel was watching me as I was focused on my task, wearing a serious expression. That evening, the three of us sat down to dinner, as we always did. Robert asked about my day, and I told him about the usual errands, the walk in the forest, but I didn't mention Daniel's unexpected visit. I felt Daniel's attention on me as I talked, but I didn't look at him, because I was afraid that Robert would notice the tension between us. After dinner, I excused myself and went up the stairs to take a bath. I thought the warm water would make me feel better, but as I stood in the tub, I started to repeat the day's events. I tried not to look at him, because I was afraid that Robert would notice the tension between us. After dinner, I went up the stairs to take a bath. I thought that the warm water would help me feel better, but while I was in the tub, I started to remember what had happened that day. I remembered Daniel's hand on mine, and how he looked at me. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. For the next few days, Daniel and I were still acting like we didn't like each other. We said hello to each other, but we weren't friendly. I felt Daniel's hand on mine again, and his intense gaze made me uncomfortable. I tried to forget it, but I couldn't. In the days that followed, there was a lot of tension between Daniel and me. We smiled at each other, but we weren't friendly. Even the simple things felt important. One day, I was folding clothes in the living room when Daniel came in and sat down. He seemed nervous and looked around the room before looking at me. "Can I ask a question?" He began, his tone serious. I answered while folding a shirt and laying it aside. He hesitated, perhaps trying to find the right words. "Do you ever wish things were different?" I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking. He started speaking in a serious tone. I answered while folding a shirt and laying it aside. He hesitated, maybe trying to find the right words. "Do you ever wish things were different?" I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He seemed embarrassed about your life. "Have you ever felt like there's something more out there, something you're missing?" The question surprised me. Wasn't ready for him to ask such a deep and thoughtful question. I looked down at the laundry on my lap, thinking for a moment. Feeling a bit vulnerable. I believe that everyone sometimes thinks about their life and the choices they've made. I gently agreed that it's normal to think about the decisions we haven't made yet and the different lives we could have lived. He nodded, seeming to agree. "Lately, I have been thinking a lot about the future and my goals. The situation is complicated." I put off doing the laundry and focused all my attention on him. "It's good to think about these things, Daniel. You're young, so you have plenty of time to figure out what you want." He offered a slight, regretful smile. "I don't see myself as young, especially when I think about important things." His words hung in the air between us, making me want to do something to help, but I didn't know what to do. Didn't say anything for a long time, each of us thinking about our own things. I really want to. I want to share my understanding of the choices and responsibilities that weigh on me, but I don't know how. Eventually, he stood up, nodded, and thanked me for listening. He left the room. I felt unusual combinations of relief and I wished I could say more to make him feel better, but I couldn't risk it. I told myself that he was my stepson, and that any closeness between us had to stay within our family. But I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. I felt a secret, calm longing for him. The tension between us was always there, and it affected every interaction. I thought about the short moments we had together, like when he stayed in the kitchen after dinner or when he asked about my day while we sat together in the living room. I felt a strange, unexplained tension between us. It affected every interaction. I thought about our short moments together, like when he stayed in the kitchen after dinner or when he asked about my day while we sat in the living room. It felt almost intimate, but I told myself it wasn't important. I was just imagining it. But I knew something had changed one evening when I was alone in the living room and Daniel joined me. He sat in his usual spot across from me. We said a few nice things, but his voice, I told myself it was nothing. I was just thinking about being close. But I knew something had changed. One evening, I was sitting alone in the living room when Daniel joined me. He sat in his usual spot across from me. We said a few nice things, but he sounded nervous and intense. Eventually, he looked at me and said that he had been thinking about our conversation about needing more. I didn't show my feelings, but I thought about what to do next. He looked away, as if he was thinking. I'm not sure if I can. He seemed unsure, as if he wasn't sure if he should be happy with things as they were. He said things that made me feel like we had a special connection, like we understood each other, and that made me feel good and worried at the same time. Daniel, I started to choose my words carefully. It's okay to feel confused. I felt reassured, but also worried. Daniel nodded slowly, thinking deeply. I know I don't want to hurt anyone, especially you. I felt his sincerity, and I had an inexplicable feeling. Sometimes, we want something different, but we have to be careful. We have to make sure that our choices don't hurt the people we love. He nodded slowly, thinking hard. I know I don't want to hurt anyone, especially you. His voice was honest, and it made me feel sad. When I thought about him not being there, it was like I was feeling the same way as my stepson. He was trying to figure out his place in the world, and he was dealing with feelings that we both had. We sat in silence, each thinking about our own things. We felt the weight of our feelings, but we didn't say what they were. I felt heartache when I thought about how he was gone, similar to how my stepson felt. We were both trying to figure out our place in the world, and we were dealing with feelings that we couldn't fully express. We sat in silence, each thinking about our own things, and we both felt the weight of our feelings. We didn't say anything, but I knew that we were both really into each other. I tried not to spend too much time alone with Daniel, because I knew that I had to be careful with the decisions I made in the future. We were attracted to each other, but we were also afraid. I tried to spend less time alone with Daniel, but I couldn't. I tried to stay away from him, but I couldn't. We were attracted to each other, and I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time we talked or spent time together, I felt more and more attracted to him. I tried to stop liking him, but I couldn't. Every time we talked or spent time together, I felt more and more attracted to him. We were attracted to each other, and I couldn't shake that feeling, even though I tried to keep our distance. Every time we talked, there was a lot of tension in the air, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. One day, when Robert was away on a business trip, I was in the kitchen looking at an old photo album. I smiled as I turned the pages, remembering vacations, birthdays, and holidays from years past. One afternoon, while Robert was away on a business trip, I found myself in the kitchen looking at an old photo album. I smiled as I turned the pages, remembering vacations, birthdays, and holidays from years past. I saw a photo of Daniel as a young teenager. His face showed energy and optimism, and I thought about how much he had grown and changed since then. I was so busy remembering that I didn't notice him coming in. He stood in the doorway and looked at the album I was holding. As I remembered different things, he walked over to the table and sat down next to me. He nodded, and I told him to take a seat. Time really does fly by, doesn't it? He sat down, leaning. As we looked at the pictures, we laughed as we turned the pages, pointing out funny hairstyles and awkward teenage poses. The conversation was easy and fun, making us feel a little better. But as time went on, we started to feel more comfortable around each other. His arm touched mine when he leaned in, and I smelled his cologne. It was a warm and friendly smell that made me feel something strong. I tried to ignore it. As we looked at the pictures, we laughed and pointed out funny hairstyles and awkward teenage poses. The conversation was easy and fun, and it made us feel a little better. But as time went on, we started to feel more comfortable with each other. His arm touched mine when he leaned in, and I smelled his cologne, a warm and friendly smell that made me feel special. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. My heart beat faster, and I looked at him, only to see him looking back at me with the same intensity we saw in the woods. It felt like the whole world was just us, and everything else disappeared. The air felt full of energy, and I saw a flash of something in his eyes. It was like he was asking something, but he didn't say it. I didn't say Diana's name, but I thought it. I looked away, and my heart was racing, but he reached out his hand and gently touched mine. I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. Then I turned back to him, unable to stop myself. His eyes showed he was nervous, and I couldn't breathe. We shouldn't have whispered, but I didn't know how to speak. He nodded, but his hand didn't move. His thumb was gently touching my knuckles. I heard him mumbling, and it sounded like he was asking me to do something, but I didn't know what to do. People were commenting that I didn't understand this, and that we didn't understand this burden. I wanted to leave to break the magic, but something made me stay still. I knew that crossing this line would change everything, and going back wouldn't be possible. But even though I knew better, I found myself leaning closer to him, attracted to him in a way that didn't make sense. Then, before I could think again, his hand reached for my face. People were talking about how I don't understand this, and how we don't understand this. I want to leave, but I can't. I know that if I leave, everything will change, and I can't go back. But I felt like I had to stay. I felt like I had to lean closer to him, even though I knew this was wrong. His hands were on my face, and he was touching my jaw. He was being so gentle that it made me gasp for air. He moved forward, and for a second, it felt like time stopped. I could feel his warm breath on my skin, and I wanted to be with him. But just as our lips were about to touch, I understood what was happening. I took back my breath and stood up, creating some space between us. I said, "I'm sorry," and I left. Daniel looked away, looking upset, and I felt ashamed. He didn't try to argue or convince me. Instead, he nodded, barely making a sound. The quiet after that was full of feelings we couldn't express, like wanting something and feeling bad about it. I could see the pain in his eyes, and he looked away, and I wanted to comfort him, but I stopped myself. "I think we both need some distance," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded again, looking at the ground. "You're right. I'm sorry," he said, then left the room. I was left alone, my heart feeling completely broken. I leaned back in my chair, my thoughts mixed together as I tried to understand the feelings I had. I knew that what had just happened was wrong, against what I believed in, but I also remembered the feeling of his touch, the warmth. I felt his hand on mine, and I looked into his eyes. I felt like I hadn't experienced that in years. I breathed in deeply and tried to think about what was going on. I couldn't let this happen again. I had to forget the strong feelings that had developed between us and move on. I couldn't let myself get caught up in those feelings, even though they were very strong. But as I sat alone, I remembered his touch. I thought about how I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling. I thought about everything that had happened in the kitchen, like the things we had said to each other, and how Daniel's eyes showed he felt weak. I felt confused and sad. I felt like I should feel guilty, but I also felt this empty feeling that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was like Daniel made me feel like I needed to be close to someone, like I needed to understand and be cared for. That afternoon, I had a lot of dreams about Daniel. In my dreams, I felt his hand on mine, saw the passion in his eyes, and heard him whisper my name. When I woke up, I felt both happy and sad. I felt sad because of what might have happened in the next few days. I tried not to be alone with him. We tried to be polite, but we were also nervous. We both knew that we didn't want to be alone. When I saw him in the hallway or said hi, I felt many emotions, like guilt, longing, and confusion, which made me feel lost. At dinner, Robert seemed unaware of the change. He was focused on his work. I admired how he lived without noticing the chaos. I wanted to talk with him and share my thoughts, but I knew some things were better left unsaid. I thought about during our encounters in the hallway or casual greetings. I felt a lot of different emotions, like guilt and confusion. At dinner, Robert seemed focused on his work. I admired how he lived his life without worrying about all the chaos. I wanted to talk with him and share my thoughts, but I knew that some things were better left unsaid. I focused on cleaning and organizing, doing things that didn't require much thought. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, my mind kept going back to Daniel and remembering his touch, his quiet words, and how warm he felt when he was near. It was like he was a ghost in my mind. Sometimes, I thought I was moving forward. One evening, I was folding clothes in the living room. I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. I was busy with household chores, doing things that didn't require much thinking, like cleaning and organizing. But I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way he touched me, the things he said to me in a whisper, and how warm he felt in my arms. I couldn't stop imagining him. One evening, I was folding clothes in the living room. I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. He looked confused, and my heart started beating faster. I looked away, pretending to focus on folding the clothes. "Diana, we need to talk." I didn't move. I looked up at him. My heart was beating really fast. I knew we had to talk, but that didn't make it easier. He sat down on the couch across from me. He looked at me, but his eyes had a doubtful look. We didn't say anything for a while. We were both afraid to cross the quiet between us, which felt like a bridge. He eventually apologized, saying he was sorry for putting you in that difficult situation. I should not have let things get so out of hand. I felt a lump in my throat. "It wasn't all your fault, Daniel. We both did it." He nodded, looking upset. "I don't want there to be any awkwardness between us. You are important to me, and I want to keep things that way." I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I replied quietly, "We need to move forward and leave this behind." He looked at me, and I saw a quick emotion, maybe regret, in his eyes. "I understood, and I will try to stay away to help you." I nodded, and I felt a sad and happy feeling in my chest. I want to tell him how important what he said was to me, but I saw that would make things worse, so I gave him a slight smile. We said things to show that we understood each other, but we didn't say anything more. We were still feeling the emotions we didn't say, and it was hard to talk about them. I went to bed with a strange mix of feelings. I felt better after talking things through, but I still felt a little sad. It was like I had believed some things for a short time, but then I didn't. The next few days were difficult. Daniel and I talked in a short way. We were quiet, and I felt a mix of emotions. I felt relieved after dealing with the tension, but I also felt empty. This feeling reminded me of the beliefs I had almost accepted, but then rejected. The next few days were difficult. Daniel and I spoke briefly and politely, and we focused on our daily routines. I liked having our own space, but every time I saw him, I felt an unknown emotion. This feeling reminded me of our connection, but now there was a clear boundary between us. I tried to enjoy new activities during the day. I did the things I liked to do that I had always enjoyed. We interacted in a polite way and focused on our daily lives. I liked having our own space, but every time I saw him, I felt a strange emotion. This made me think about the connection we used to have. To feel normal again, I did new things I enjoyed. I painted, and I had a small studio in the sunlight. I spent hours there, looking at the bright colors and textures. I used art to express my feelings. I also started to walk through the woods and explore new areas. At night, I would sit in the living room, drink tea, and watch the shadows move on the walls. I had ignored my painting for a long time, but I started painting again. I had a small studio in the sunlight where I spent hours painting with bright colors and textures. I used art to express my feelings. I also started going on long walks through the woods, exploring new areas of the forest. At night, I would sit alone in the living room, drinking tea and watching the shadows move on the walls. I felt very calm. I thought about Robert and the life we had together. I realized that I had become so busy with my marriage that I had forgotten about my own life. I had stopped thinking about my own goals and dreams because I was busy being a wife, mother, and stepmother. I did not stop to think about what I wanted. One evening, while I was drawing a landscape by the window, Robert allowing the stillness to envelop me like a soothing blanket, I thought about Robert and the life we had built together. I realized that I had become so busy with my marriage that I had forgotten about my own identity, goals, and dreams. I was so focused on being a wife, mother, and stepmother that I didn't stop to think about what I needed. One evening, while I was drawing a landscape by the window, Robert came into the room and sat next to me, looking at me with a curious expression. "You've been spending a lot of time on your work lately," he said with a playful tone in his voice. "I didn't know you still enjoyed it so much." I smiled, and I felt warm inside. I guess I didn't realize how important his comment was when he gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "I'm happy you found something that makes you happy, Diana. You've been working a lot lately. I didn't realize you enjoyed it so much. I'm happy for you." I smiled. I felt warm inside. I guess I didn't realize how important his words were when he gently touched my shoulder. "I'm glad you found something that makes you happy, Diana." His words made me feel embarrassed about how we'd stopped talking over the years. Robert was a good person and a good husband. I knew I needed to make our relationship a priority. So, I tried to spend more time with my husband. I started talking to him more. I planned little trips, and I tried to get closer to him. I felt shame about how we had drifted apart. Robert was a good person and a good husband. I knew I had to make our relationship a priority. I tried to spend more time with him and our marriage. It was hard, and sometimes I felt sad about Daniel. But I remembered how Robert was a good husband. As time went on, I felt less sad about Daniel. I felt happy and calm. The time we spent in the forest was a long time ago. It was a time that made me see parts of myself that I didn't know before. I knew that. The experience was difficult, and at times, I couldn't express my emotions for Daniel, which made it hard for me to move forward. But I thought about how Robert was a source of love and stability. As time went on, I started to feel more and more at peace. The intensity of those days in the forest became a distant memory, a chapter in my life that made me realize some things about myself. I knew that even though our connection was not spoken about, it would always be there. But I was determined to be happy in the life I had made. One evening, after a walk in the woods, I met Daniel at the edge of the forest. He looked thoughtful as I got closer, and he smiled at me a little. He said, "I thought I'd find you here." I nodded, feeling a strong sense of nostalgia. "I visit this place," I said quietly. "It has become." We were still connected, but I was determined to be happy in the life I had made. One evening, after a walk in the woods, I met Daniel at the edge of the forest. He looked thoughtful as I approached, and he smiled at me. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. I nodded, feeling a strong sense of nostalgia. "It's my place to relax." We were silent for a while as we looked at the slowly fading light that was coming through the trees. We silently understood each other. We shared the realization that some experiences are just impossible. "I just wanted to thank you," he said at last. His voice was strong and clear. "For everything. For your support, even when I didn't deserve it." I felt a lot of emotions, and I couldn't speak. "Daniel," I told him that I'm grateful for his family, and that I'll always be there for him. I saw a warmth in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "I'm thankful for our final look at each other, and for the quiet goodbye to the past." It made me feel like everything was coming to an end, even though what we had was real. It taught us about love and life. As time went on, I learned about human connection and the intricacies of love. Over time, Daniel moved away, and I started a friendship with Robert. We talked about our time in the woods, which was an important part of my life, but it wasn't as important as it used to be now. It's a part of my journey, teaching me about myself. I learned about awareness, boundaries, and the power of choice. In my newfound solitude, I embraced my passion for art, integrating it into my daily life. I derived pleasure from the fundamental process of creation, via colors and textures that enabled me to articulate emotions I had long suppressed. The nature served as my inspiration, the beauty and mystery inspired me in unforeseen ways. Reflecting on my encounter with Daniel, I saw it as a pivotal moment, a catalyst for personal growth and self-discovery. Awareness, boundaries, and the power of choice in my newfound solitude. I embraced my passion for art, integrating it into my daily life. I derived pleasure from the fundamental process of creation via colors and textures that enabled me to express emotions I had long suppressed. The nature served as my inspiration, the beauty and mystery inspired me in unexpected ways. Reflecting on my encounter with Daniel, I saw it as a pivotal moment, a catalyst for personal growth and self-discovery. It revealed the significance of authenticity, the necessity of honoring my own needs and desires, and the attainment of tranquility in my decisions. Life persisted with serene moments of joy and contemplation, and I discovered satisfaction in the existence I had cultivated, the love I had fostered, and the individual I had become. Although the recollection, I had a realization that changed my life. I learned what it means to be authentic, to listen to my own needs, and to find peace in my decisions. Life went on, and I had moments of joy and peace. I was happy with the life I had made for myself. But the memory of that time in the woods would always be with me. That memory helped shape my future. I now understand that love is not just about holding on. Sometimes, love means letting go and finding comfort in the journey. It means learning to appreciate the beauty of the present. That was enough for me.